Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the very first of our All Souls seminars at home for this term. It's very exciting that we've restarted, and it's even more exciting as you can see that I'm in my office. Can we just do the usual, which is, can everybody who's here, can you mute and have your cameras off while we are having the speaker? And then at the end, once the speaker is finished, if you want to ask a question, either put your little hand up or write Q in the chat. And when it's your turn to ask a question, don't forget to put your camera on and your microphone on. So today we're very lucky to have Kiran Grewal, who is here today to talk to us. Kiran is Reader in Sociology at Goldsmiths College, University of London, where she currently convenes the MA in Human Rights, Culture and Social Justice. Her research interests span a wide range of topics, from human rights and post-conflict justice, feminist and subaltern legal and social theory, to post-colonial policing. Kiran is the author of 2 books, The Socio-Political Practice of Human Rights and Racialized Gang Rape and the Reinforcement of Dominant Order. Kiran is actually in Sydney, and so is talking to us from far away in time and space. And she's going to be talking today about sexual violence and the boundaries of the nation. I'm going to hand over to you now, Kiran, to share your screen.
Great, thank you, Mary. Right, I will share my screen. I hope that I can manage to navigate across the different screens. We'll see how we go. Has that shared?
Yes, yeah, that's all fine. Oh no, actually, sorry, it hasn't. I can't see the PowerPoint.
No, hang on.
Now it's starting. There we go.
Yeah, okay. Right. Yeah, okay, we'll see how this goes, because I've realized I've also got my paper open on the same screen, so we'll see how we go. The slides are not important. As I said to Mary, it was mainly just so that I didn't bore you all with just looking at me sort of gesticulating for 40 minutes. I'm also going to time myself, because I'm really keen for this to be as interactive a discussion as possible. So first of all, thank you, Mary, for inviting me, and thank you all for taking the time to come along. So I'm going to be speaking, the starting point is from my book, Racialized Gang Rape and the Reinforcement of Dominant Order. I sort of hesitated whether or not to present on this topic initially, because partly I was thinking the case studies I researched in the book are quite old now. I mean, they date back to the early 2000s. And I wondered if I still had something fresh or interesting to say on the topic. But actually, the more I thought about it, partly because, as luck would have it, I'm back in Australia unexpectedly. And many of the gang rapists who were convicted at the time are now coming up for parole or the end of their sentences. And so it's sort of been back in public discussion, but also it just sort of reinforced the particular significance that the set of gang rapes in the Australian context that I write about in the book, the kind of level of national attention that they garnered is still very much present. But also I think that many of the arguments that I make in the book, or at least that I gesture towards, are depressingly still salient. So just by way of example, a couple of weeks ago, when the debates were raging about violence against women again, following the murder of Sarah Everard, a Pakistani woman who is on an anti-racism feminist WhatsApp group that I'm also part of, posted to complain of the backlash she had been receiving for something that she had tweeted. It was met with a barrage of men accusing her of betraying the community, feeding Islamophobia, and exaggerating the problems within the Muslim, specifically Pakistani community. In recounting this, my aim is not to demonize Muslim men, nor to suggest that their fears of Islamophobic responses when we speak of violence against women in ethnic minority communities are completely misplaced. Indeed, the very reason why we have this WhatsApp group and others like it that I've been part of in the past in Australia and in France, more recently in Sri Lanka, where I spend a lot of my time, and in the UK, is that many of us are afraid of how to speak from a feminist perspective without seeing our voices and words co-opted for various other agendas. So the reason that I give this example is that I think it does return us to the problematic that I concluded my book with, and that I think remains an issue for us today, some 20 years on from the original gang rapes I wrote about. Why is an anti-racist feminist response to violence against women either committed within ethnic minority communities or by perpetrators identified from ethnic minority backgrounds still so elusive? Should just hesitate for a moment and say I'm using this shorthand of ethnic minority just because I work across many different contexts, and there are sort of different language that gets used to describe these communities in different places. I'm just using this as a shorthand, and also to say I will sort of sometimes refer to Muslim men. Sometimes they get identified certainly in the Sydney gang rapes as Lebanese or Arab. In the French context, they're often not sort of identified with a particular racial identity. As I explain in the book, there's lots of ways in which these various different labels get conflated in public discourse. So I'm kind of conscious of what I'm doing here. So just to explain why there seems to be a slippage between these terms. But anyway, so to go back to that question of why has it been so difficult to develop an anti-racist feminist response? I don't want to suggest that there hasn't been any work in this area, and certainly I want to pay tribute to the incredibly important work that has been happening quite often at a quite localized level, at the level of political and social activism. But I wanted to sort of ask the question of why there still seem to be so many structural barriers to that sort of a discourse actually being able to be anything other than marginal, and always kind of under attack from either the accusations of feeding Islamophobia or racism or anti-immigration, or on the other hand, a sort of co-option of a particular version of feminism that a particular version of feminism that actually doesn't really represent the interests of women either within ethnic minority communities or outside. So really, this was a question that actually was the starting point for the research for the book. So this was in the early 2000s. I was living in Australia, and there were a series of gang rapes that attracted a lot of media attention, and they were represented, even though there was sort of a number of different cases that were brought before the courts. They were represented as this gang rape phenomenon that was a problem in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney, particularly identified as young Muslim men going out in gangs looking for what were interchangeably referred to as Australian or white Australian women, targeting them for rape. And so there were a series of high-profile trials. It led to also a whole flurry of law reform, lots of debates within the media, also political debates about the kind of crisis of the legal system in responding to sexual violence. So in some ways, it seemed like, okay, this was a moment where, many of the kind of complaints that feminists had been making of the system were being taken up. But very quickly, the discussions about the sort of inadequacies of the legal system, there was a sort of discussion of this sort of culture of tolerance of sexual violence. Very quickly, that culture question shifted from being about legal culture or broader culture to being funneled into debates about multiculturalism and particular cultures, and tied up with debates about immigration. At the same time, so sorry, I should move my slides. So this is just some images from the time. And just to, as I said, this is, it's sort of reared its head again in the last couple of years because a number of the rapists, the convicted rapists are now out in the community. And so there have been sort of various news stories again in Australia about, their their behavior, their lack of remorse, the kind of idea that they're still this sort of threat that is posed to the community. At the same time, around the same time in France, there was a similar discussion about, or similar sort of crisis around the idea of sexual violence and particularly gang rape as being a problem. In the French context, this sort of really came to the fore, partly through the release of a film, La Squale, and partly through a particular group of North African women who had been campaigning for quite a long time about issues of racism and sexism in the banlieue, in the housing sort of estates on the outskirts of major cities, but they sort of really come to the fore and attract a lot of attention around 2003. And one of the women associated with that, Samira Bellil, also published an autobiography in which she describes her experience of gang rape on a number of different occasions. And in all of these texts, the term tournante gets used for the first time, and it's a banlieue term, slang term, that is about referring to taking turns, the sort of passing around of a joint, but that became a slang term for gang rape. And you see this term then start to appear within the mainstream media, even, sort of conservative newspapers like Le Figaro produce articles where Le Tournante is referred to in the title. And so quite quickly we have the establishment of a particular form of sexual violence that is located very much in the banlieue. So even though it's not specifically identified as connected with a particular immigrant population or Islam, through the identification with the banlieue, which for many commentators had been remarking since the 80s, has in French imaginary been associated with immigrants and particularly North Africans. There was this kind of racialized dimension to the gang rapes that was assumed from the beginning. So as I was following these rapes, I was really troubled by the fact that I didn't know quite how to respond. On the one hand, I was very skeptical about this kind of newfound feminism, that where everybody's really concerned about, the sort of mistreatment of survivors of sexual violence, the inadequacies of the legal system, the kind of flourishing of rape myths within society. How come now? And why in these cases? And at the same time, there was a kind of another response to them, which I found equally problematic, which was to say, this is all a moral panic. This is just another excuse to demonize and stigmatize particular racialized groups of men. And that felt to me like a kind of collapsing of, on the one hand, definitely this sort of pseudo-feminist language that was being used by right-wing commentators in, the very same commentators or political figures who are anti-multiculturalism, anti-immigration. But at the same time, there were genuine concerns raised about, obviously, not just the sexual violence and the importance of responding to that, but also the ways in which there were the rapists themselves made reference to culture and to difference. And so, there were sort of examples in the Sydney gang rapes of them specifically referring to some of their victims as Aussie sluts, or, sort of speaking about, we're going to fuck you Leb style. And there was also a kind of community response that obviously, attracted the most attention. So, there were obviously plenty of community responses that were highly critical, but there did seem to be also a kind of community response that sought to sort of downplay the sexual violence and to focus very much on, but our boys are always victimized, and this is what else do you expect, if they're constantly deprived of jobs and they're constantly subjected to racism. So the book was really, which was my PhD thesis, was really an attempt to kind of work through how I could respond in both a kind of anti-racist and feminist way. So there's a couple of things that I really want to kind of pull out from the ways in which I made sense of what I think was happening in those particular rapes, but also that I think kind of resonates later. I mean, I think resonates with some of the discussions that have happened in the UK, you know, in response to the Rochdale and Rotherham grooming cases, but also in other contexts. So first of all, one of the things that I thought was really important to point out was the ways in which the problem for me was very much one of colluding patriarchies. So we see that while there are different positions taken on the rapes, what seemed to be shared by both the rapists themselves, the community responses that supported them in certain instances, and even by some of the anti-racist responses that were critical of how they were being treated. All of those on one hand, and then the sort of critical responses on the other, basically assumed that the problem was one between men. The kind of assumed value of the women was never in question. They all seemed to understand what women's bodies signified. This was, you know, either an attack on the community intentionally. It was about defending our women. It was about defending their women. But the kind of symbolic significance of the women's bodies was not called into question. Nor was there really a sort of deeper debate about the problems of particular norms of heterosexuality, norms of masculinity or femininity. None of that was really called into question. And so, you know, I would say that in terms of the kind of the instances of sexual violence that we're dealing with, they really did conform to what has been described in, you know, feminist literature for a long time as, you know, the kind of ideal real rapes that are always recognized and condemned. What we do see happening is that this particular version of sexual violence allows for the kind of displacement of all issues of misogyny and sexism onto a particular ethnicized group. And as a result, a kind of self-narrative of national and racial superiority and civilization. So Eric Fassin has sort of written about this even before I started this research, in the context of France, where he argued that we see a sort of shifting of articulation of Republican values away from an idea of fraternity towards gender equality as a kind of hallmark of the nation state. And I similarly found that, you know, there was a way in which Australia was allowed to reconstitute itself as a feminist nation through the displacement of misogyny onto Muslim migrant populations. And certainly I think, you know, it's very interesting. Again, I'm obviously very much embroiled back in the Australian context. And so I doubt it's sort of really made the news for all of you. But there have been lots of debates in Australia in the last couple of months around, there's been a number of scandals of sexual violence and the sort of cultures of sexism within Australian political culture, within Parliament House itself, and the Prime Minister's response has been just so incredibly inept. So I think it's sort of an interesting contrast to look at, you know, the way in which this has been handled, alongside this kind of narrative that was very much present during the responses to the gang rapes throughout the sort of early 2000s and 2010 on, where there was this kind of constant suggestion that, well, we could just deport the problem, that, you know, this problem of violence against women or sexism was something that was external, or certainly possible to be made external. And I don't think that this kind of identification of feminism as the hallmark of the nation is particularly unique to France and Australia. And I think we've seen consistently in many different contexts that these appeals are being made to a commitment to gender equality, to be part of the Western liberal democratic state, as a response to the kind of sexism of all these other cultures that are coming in. And there's a tendency to take for granted the assumption that it is liberal democracy that produces the guarantee of gender equality, and exposure to this will liberate women of different ethnic minority backgrounds. And in fact, a recent example of this, I can move to my next slide, can be found in the work of a prominent scholar, a UK scholar who works on honour-based gender violence in the UK. So this is her writing in 2008. So she writes, the notion of honour acts as a smokescreen. I'll cut out a little bit here. A key aspect of the problem of defining honour involves the conflict between patriarchal systems, which have deep historical and cultural roots, and systems founded on principles of equality, i.e. equal rights or equality before the law. Violation of these principles must no longer be allowed to persist in the name of preserving cultural values in minority communities, when these are fundamentally at odds with concepts of equality and human rights held by the wider society. So I don't mean to single this particular scholar out. I think, in many ways, this is a sort of quite an established common sense. It's an argument that was made by Susan Moller-Okin back in 1989, and has kind of seen itself being reproduced over and over again in various different ways. And I think it's a common sense that actually many women within ethnic minority communities themselves often hold. And so, for example, Samira Belil, who I mentioned before in the French context, in an interview was quoted as saying, I would date anyone on the earth, but not an Arab. They're all thugs or fundamentalists. And, the way I sort of interpreted that was actually quite understandable in the context of her lived experience. But of course, then feeds into this idea that, the women within the community themselves are kind of constantly at threat and disgusted by their own men. And similarly, I've written about the controversial Dutch Somali writer Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and the ways in which she also has used her own personal experience as a kind of justification for condemning Islam. And in the article that I wrote about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I kind of argue that this is actually, she poses a problem to us as post-colonial feminists, because I don't think that just ignoring her or accusing her of being, either a passive dupe or actively, in her own self-interest, sort of promoting, Islamophobic or racist views. I don't think that kind of adequately addresses the challenge she poses. And I think it doesn't really adequately address the sorts of people who actually do engage with her arguments. Yes, there are those on the right who find her a very convenient support for what they already want to say about immigrant communities. But I've also had so many young students come up and, once they sort of find out what I work on, come up and ask me, I've read this book, what do you think? So I think she, as a post-colonial feminist, I feel like part of the challenge that she poses is because we have been so afraid to speak about certain things because of our fear of co-option, and because we are always kind of conscious of the ways in which it's very difficult to speak critically about things that might be going on within ethnic minority communities without being co-opted. We've perhaps been too quiet, and as a result, there's a space that opens up precisely for these sorts of voices to actually be ultimately the only voices that really get heard in this space. And I think there is also a problem, and this is where, I was saying to Mary, a lot of my kind of more recent work, which, provides a kind of new lens for me to look back on this research, is looking at sort of the lens of decoloniality. And when I think about it, even from my own personal background as a Punjabi woman, I struggled as a young woman to find the kind of theoretical resources on which to ground my feminism, even though my feminism very much emerged from the role models in my own family or within the community. So I don't feel like it was something that was kind of external, but in terms of the kind of theoretical framing of it, it was very difficult to find those resources from within the community. And this is really part of the decolonial challenge to dismantle what Annabel Chianu and Maria Lugones have referred to as the colonial matrix of knowledge. Raewyn Connell has also written about this very powerfully, about how this sort of global political economy of knowledge production has also meant that, you know, quite often when we talk about issues of gender or we talk about feminism, the raw material is gathered from everywhere else, but it can only, the theory is always assumed to only be able to be achieved, produced in very specific spaces, you know, at the kind of heart of the metropole. So this produces really big problems because it makes it very difficult for, on the one hand, the patriarchal order within mainstream society to be critiqued, because there is a kind of constant displacement of all of the problems of sexism and misogyny and patriarchy onto the ethnic minority. And at the same time, it kind of constantly reinforce, and so feminists are kind of accused of, well, you know, don't you realize that actually the West, you know, you've got it really good compared to all of these other backward, oppressive societies. But there's also a kind of reinforcing of the illegitimacy or inauthenticity of non-Western or non-white feminist voices. And I think that this comes through in the Rochdale and Rotherham grooming cases, where the issue becomes not just a problem of, you know, the acts of particular perpetrators, but I mean, what we know from, you know, what has kind of come out subsequently about both Rochdale and Rotherham is the kind of the systemic failings because of all of the biases of the British justice system, and, you know, the kind of blind spots and the kind of accepted, you know, whether it's based on class or gender, you know, the kind of levels of acceptance of violence or abuse were part of the problem, but they kind of get written out of the story once we sort of add a cultural explanation, because then we can displace all of the problems of sexism onto the Muslim groomer. And certainly in the Sydney gang rape trials, we could see this also. I mean, when I looked through the judgments, I mean, there are many parts of the various judgments that highlight all of the same problems with how the judiciary understands what causes rape, how to respond to rape, how rape gets characterized. All of the problems that have been documented by feminist legal scholars for decades were also present in those gang rape judgments. But that was never, you know, there was no attention to the kind of sexism contained within the Australian legal system, because all of that could be displaced onto Muslims. At the same time, the ways in which culture, this sort of takes me to the next point that I wanted to make. Just trying to keep an eye on the time, because I do want to make sure I actually get to where I think we should go next. But the other aspect that I think is really important is, and it kind of links to this idea of colluding patriarchies, is that when culture was invoked in the cases of the Sydney gang rape trials, when culture was invoked, it was a particular patriarchal version of culture that was endorsed by the judiciary, by the legal system itself. So it wasn't just the version that the rapists put forward in their trial, but also the kind of what was accepted by the court was essentially a version of culture that, one, was very much informed by kind of colonial stereotypes and Orientalist stereotypes, but also kind of reinforced and endorsed the idea that a patriarchal conservative version of the culture is likely to be the most authentic or true version of that. So it raised really important questions about who speaks for culture. So in the one case where one of the defendants did try to make a cultural argument, evidence was led from a white male Australian anthropologist who had studied Pakistani, the Northwest Frontier province of Pakistan, actually in the 70s. And he was presented as the authoritative expert on Pakistani culture. how the culture was defined. So there was a lot of talk about, cultural norms that had been violated by the young women drinking with the men, by being alone with men that they didn't know, and that this would have been such a shock to the defendants. My response to that would be, well, those cultural norms also apply to the young men, so presumably they weren't so shocked by it, because if they were, they wouldn't have been sitting there drinking with women they didn't know either. And then the idea that the reason that this cultural defense was ultimately rejected was that the judge found that while he accepted that that was all probably true, he believed that the defendants had been long enough in Australia that they understood what Australian values were. And when I have used this in teaching subsequently, it's always been very interesting to see how it gets responded to by different groups of students. So I used this in a criminology class that I was teaching at the University of Sydney, and one female law student said, when I asked, what they thought of the reasoning, said, well, yes, the judge was right, because ultimately the victims in these cases were not themselves Pakistani Muslim girls, so they couldn't possibly have known the cultural norms, which of course, raises really important questions about, so are we assuming that Pakistani women all accept that this is the version of culture that they have to ascribe to? Is there no possibility that there would be any kind of feminist response to this? Is there no contestation that currently happens within Pakistani culture of these very norms? But all of that gets completely erased in the version of culture that is endorsed by all the different parties. And this sort of takes me to, so, on the one hand, I think this kind of reinforces the critique that people like Rita Damoun have made, Sheila Ben Habib have made, of the kind of very essentialized and very problematic ideas of culture that get invoked within liberal political theory, but then also translate into the versions of law, policy, institutional politics we see within liberal democratic states. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's not just happening in these sites, that this version of a kind of essentialized culture, this problematic version of essentialized culture, is also being reproduced through the responses of many of the actors themselves, and many of the ethnic minority community responses. And that's where in the book I use this idea of a postcolonial habitus, so sort of drawing on the work of Bourdieu, and the idea of the habitus as, the ways in which we sort of, through the absorption and internalization of various structures around us, learn to perform certain versions of ourselves. I argued that actually the ways in which many of the non-white subjects in this process performed their identities ultimately reinforced many of, and kind of continued to reproduce many of the stereotypes about them that were also being used by mainstream society to kind of justify their exclusion. So, for example, there was a lot of, as I said, in the anti-racist responses. On the one hand, there was this kind of critique of the kind of, there was a use of the kind of moral panic frame to say, this is another example of how, we're going to demonize a particular group. But then there were also sort of engagements with not just the rapists themselves, but some of the other young men who kind of emulated this version of masculinity to say, well, this is a type of protest masculinity that is a kind of, it's an inevitable response to the marginalization, stigmatization of these men. And this is an argument that has actually sort of grown in explanatory value, it seems, in recent years in Australia. And it comes through quite clearly in the work of Michael Muhammad Ahmed, who is a novelist who has won a number of awards in Australia in recent years, most recently for his book Lebs, which I think came out in 2018, and is also quite a vocal, he's an activist and quite a sort of vocal commentator on particularly the kind of stigmatization of young men in the southwest of Sydney. His novel, The Lebs, just to sort of give you a sense of the place that the Sydney gang rapes hold in the kind of public imaginary in Australia. He refers to Bill Al-Scaff, who was identified as one of the ringleaders throughout the book without any explanation. I mean, it just sort of gives you a sense of just how widely known this name actually is. But he also tells a story basically of a series of characters that this is sort of semi-autobiographical but fictionalized, talking about his own personal experience growing up in Punchbowl in southwest Sydney. But his novel is kind of littered with characters who actively model their sexual encounters on the accounts of the gang rapists' hunting of young women. And while his description is ironic and critical, making fun of the boys, and also quite often sort of demonstrating that it's stupidity and kind of fantasy rather than actually, producing, that they're not actually going out and doing a lot of this. I don't think it does very much to actually challenge that model of masculinity. And so his main, even though this is what he asserts that he wants to do, and certainly in his kind of public interventions, that's what he's constantly referred to. And so his main character sort of appears to, on the one hand, struggle between a desire towards a sort of softer, more romantic interaction with the opposite sex, and then is kind of constantly positioned as the misogynist and rapist. But ultimately, it kind of doesn't really do, there's nothing in the novel that kind of really pushes this particular version of the Leb identity beyond what is already kind of quite well established. And indeed, in his kind of public responses to the novel, which is the bottom paragraph on this slide, he actually just refers to ethnographic work that has been done that has argued that actually this sort of version of masculinity is born out of frustration, a sense of injury, a defensiveness. And so it ends up just sounding a lot like that basically the only response to racism is this particular version of kind of hyper masculinity and this particularly sort of misogynistic, sexist version. And it's very interesting that Ahmed actually sort of in his engagements, public engagements, and he's also done a PhD thesis, while he refers to the work of bell hooks occasionally, and he does kind of call into question the lack of representation that there ever is of Muslim or Arab or Lebanese women, he actually doesn't do anything about that in any of his writing. And he picks up on bell hooks's point about the kind of the arguments she's made about particular versions of Black masculinity, without ultimately engaging with the point that she really makes, that this approach, this kind of particular version of masculinity, is ultimately useless in terms of formulating any sort of meaningful anti-racist, never mind feminist, anti-racist response. And I just feel like, as somebody who is speaking a lot about this at the moment in the Australian context, and who is getting quite a lot of airtime, it's just a kind of, for me, it's sort of a depressing reminder that the lessons that none of the lessons from kind of earlier discussions that we've had have actually seemed to have kind of penetrated at the level of public discourse. And similarly, in the French context, back in 2007-8, I was because I had been quite skeptical about the way in which Ni Pute Ni Soumise, the feminist organization I mentioned before, had been co-opted in the name of a kind of feminist French republicanism. I was very excited that there was this counter movement that established itself called the Feminist Indigène de la République, and that they were sort of really trying to tease out the tensions between, on the one hand, this version of white Republican feminism, and on the other hand, kind of patriarchal versions of anti-racism. In 2009, I was in Paris and I met Uriya Boutelja, who was one of the kind of founders of this, and told her of my excitement. And she quickly told me that the movement was dead. It was too hard, she said, to combat the homophobia and sexism of the banlieue and to win the support of the men. And that's why the focus had to be on the issue of racism first and foremost. I was horrified and just threw up my hands and said to her, but you drew inspiration from the Black feminists, from the Chicana movement, and did you learn nothing from them, that time never comes when, you know, we've overcome the problem of racism and then it's women's time. Since then, Boutelja has become a complete darling of the French decolonial scene, and in fact, internationally is known as a kind of prominent decolonial scholar, and has become more militantly anti-feminist. So I've got a little, this is the last slide. So from her book from 2016, she basically argues that her Indigenous sisters need to recognize that our bodies are not our own. They belong to our families, our clans, our communities, and we have to stop being led astray by the white Prince Charming fantasies that we are sold. She recognizes that we are often placed, we non-white women are often placed in the crossfire of patriarchies, but only one of those patriarchies for her is problematic, white patriarchy, which is conquering and self-assured, while she represents Indigenous patriarchy as dominated and desperate. This leads her to say, this is in her words, like Assata Shakur, we can never be free while our men are oppressed, and that we must kind of find strategies, the narrow margin of freedom we can negotiate between men's survival strategies that consist of exposing their pets and making a display of their virility. The radical critique of Indigenous patriarchy, she argues, is a luxury, and basically it reduces us to becoming bodies available for white male consumption, or disembodied beurettes, so that's a critique of ni put ni soumise, or Black women and girls alienated from the community. So basically her option is silence. I mean, my response to that would be, since 2009, when there was a withdrawal of this feminist agenda, to now, how has the failure to speak about feminist issues or to take a feminist stand, what has that contributed to building a more effective anti-racist politics in France or anywhere else? So I suppose what I want to kind of conclude with here, and I'm conscious, I said to Mary I wouldn't do more than 40 minutes, and I'm just about at 40 minutes, so I'll have to be quick. But what do I think are possible ways forward? Well, one, I think one of the concerns I have is that intersectionality, and actually Jasbir Kaur has said something similar, although slightly different, but I think we're in agreement that intersectionality has been more effectively deployed to respond to feminism's whiteness than, in Kaur's words, as a critical race intervention to disrupt masculinist frames. And so this is where I think that kind of point of the colluding patriarchies is just, I don't think that intersectionality has helped us work through that sufficiently. I also would say that I'm deeply troubled by some of the decolonial feminist interventions, which, as far as I can see, seem to do little to foreground either women's liberation or alternative foundations of feminism. So in fact, I would say that interventions like Boutelja's reinforce the problematic that feminists like Uma Narayan identified back in the 1990s, that we are kind of constantly casting feminism as a Western discourse in a way that completely negates and effaces the agency, the thought, the creativity, the resistance of women all over the world who are finding all sorts of foundations for a feminist politics that are not purely drawn from a particular Western liberal version of feminist politics. And Priyamvada Gopal has made a similar argument. So I think that's why we need to be very attentive to this problem of the analytical category of culture, and much more attentive to the ways in which culture is invoked, by whom, for what purposes. And this is really an argument that Rita Damun has made very powerfully about the importance of shifting from the idea of culture to the cultural. And she has sort of a series of questions that she thinks that this move would help us to think through about how identities are made and marked by processes of meaning making through power. What are the outcomes of these significations? How are the meanings understood by self and others? In what ways are dominant and subordinating systems of meaning making sustained in these ideas of culture? I think we also need to ask the question of why, when there has been so much rich and nuanced work on trying to deal with questions of diversity and difference, to deal with colonialism and the kind of ongoing coloniality in relation to women and to feminism, why there has not been a similar attentiveness to masculinity. And to me, I think that the model of masculinity that seems to be kind of completely accepted by men on all sides, not saying real life men as in, you know, the kind of the dominant narratives around masculinity have been remarkably similar. So there is this idea of, you know, there is a masculinity that white men have taken from non-white men want it back. You know, it's all connected with a particular version of, as Raoul Rao has identified quite often, you know, quite harsh homophobia. Also these ideas of a kind of hyper masculinity that actually not only make it impossible to create solidarity with other groups, you know, women, queer communities, but also ultimately leave a lot of non-white men, non-Western men, actually back in the same kind of hierarchies with white men that they're supposedly trying to disrupt. So I would argue that the protest masculinity, in conforming to all of the worst stereotypes, actually does nothing to disrupt the white patriarchal order. In fact, if anything, it kind of shores it up. And so I think a really important site of intervention is the ways in which we engage with this question of masculinity. And not least because there are, and this is something that Boutelja just completely erases, and in fact is quite disparaging of versions of masculinity in her book, of versions of masculinity that talk about gender reform, for example, arguing that you know, this is actually just some sort of colonial inferiority complex. So as a result, the only form of masculinity that is in play is this particular hyper-masculine, virile form of masculinity. So it's also a kind of complete erasure of other possible ways in which ethnic minority men can and do perform their masculinity. And so I suppose what I want to kind of conclude with is that I think part of the problem is the problem of identity politics. And I know, again, this is not a new argument. I think it takes us back to many of the arguments that Wendy Brown made back in 1995, that identity politics is a form of politics that will always reduce us to a fixedness of an I am identity that weds us to identities of oppression that are the cause of our suffering. And at the same time will always put us in a battle for space against this unquestioned norm, which is most often characterized as the white middle class masculinity. And so we are always just in a conflict. All the rest of us are all just in conflict, fighting for that space. And so I think, you know, taking up Brown's question of how do we turn away from what I am to what I want, what would that mean for our politics? And I think sort of just absolutely finally, I think this is where both Spivak's question of how do we move away from the debate about whether we celebrate or deny difference towards asking what sort of inequality brings its use and who can deny difference on different occasions and in what interests differences are defined, I think is really important. And so too, I think Jasbir Kaur's suggestion that we enhance our ideas of intersectionality by incorporating a more assemblage-based approach to categories. So rather than seeing these categories as entities and attributes of subjects, that we see them as events, actions, encounters between bodies. I think if we put these insights into action when analyzing the identities that emerged as visible in situations like the gang rapes, we can use them as ways to explore how multiculturalism has enacted and reproduced particular colonial versions of cultural difference, particular patriarchal assumptions of community. And hopefully in the process, we can also try to valorize identities. And in the process of this, and now I'm going to read the last bit so that I don't mess it up. In the process of this analysis, we can hopefully start to see that trying to valorize identities imposed on us, which I think is what the sort of armored approach is not breaking the circuits of power. Only by articulating radically different positions can we actually do that disruptive work. Sorry, I did talk much longer than I had expected to, so I hope that there's still time for a bit of discussion.